All right, good evening. It's good to see each of you. We're continuing our study through the book of Revelation, and we almost got finished with chapter 12. There was a lot of verses that were still left, but I got ahead of myself in the last class, and so we've actually covered a lot of the material. So I think this will move pretty quickly as we finish up chapter 12. So again, very symbolic. We've been looking at signs, symbols representing the devil as a dragon, Jesus is a male child, and then the core spiritual Israel, God's people on earth, represented as the woman that produced the male child, and that, well, we're going to see what happens next. So, the dragon, the devil, goes after the male child, but the male child succeeds, is caught up to heaven, and is out of reach. And so what does the dragon do next? Plan A fails, so what's plan B?
Go after the children.
Before that,
He goes after war in heaven.
war in heaven, but after that, he's kicked. So he's been kicked from heaven down to earth, and now that he's down on earth, persecute the woman. Good. All right. So I jumped all around. I mean, I totally get why it's kind of confusing because I was all over the place last time. All right, so verses 12 to 13, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Notice, this is not something that's an issue for them anymore. All right, this is something that he's been removed from the place. So, woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea. Now, this is the place that has to worry about him. For the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So, we have him at this point, now that he can no longer get to the male child, to Jesus, now he takes all of his wrath, all of his contempt, and he focuses it on the woman, and it's even intensified because he knows that he doesn't have very long. And so, whatever he hopes to accomplish, he's got to do it pretty quickly. So, very intensely, he goes after the woman. So, this is what we talked about last time. This represents the devil going after the early church as an institution, trying to destroy the organization of the church. All right? Now, that, at the beginning, this would represent Israel's spiritual, the faithful remnant of Israel that brought Jesus. But once Jesus accomplished his work, well, those faithful spiritual people would have become the early church. And so this institution, if you will, of God's faithful people would have transformed from Jewish people into Jews and Gentiles in the early church. So Romans 9:6 that we've used several times before, not everyone is of Israel that is of Israel. There was an Israel within Israel, a spiritual core Israel. All right, notice again the usage of the short time. If we're talking about 2,000 years, 2,000 plus years later, then this doesn't make any sense. So this eliminates the application of the historical, the futurist, and the idealist positions that either say the application is far off or it doesn't have a specific application, that it's more generic. And this also ties it back to our 42 months, 1,260 days, times, and half a time, so 3.5 times. So again, we know that this intense period of persecution that's for a little while, something's going to happen to the devil at the end of that. And he's going to not have access to what he's trying to accomplish at this time. So this access to the woman and what we're going to see next, that's going to run out for him. So we're going to get to that later in the book. All right, so that was kind of attack number 1. We see that she is attacked again. The devil is not able to get to her, so he tries to get at her a different way. So how is she attacked and then saved this second time?
The serpent spewed water out of its mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth.
All right, very good. So that's the easy part. Now, what does that mean? What does that represent? So just kind of keep the timeline. He tries to persecute her. She's given wings and is able to escape. We're going to look at that in just a second. But then we've got the floods that he spews out of his mouth, but then the earth swallows it.
Is that divine intervention?
Intervention, yes, but the other one is going the other way. So, all right, so let's walk through it. And I'm going to have to kind of get a little ahead of ourselves to try to explain part of this, but we're going to see some of this decoded for us actually in about half a chapter. So the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. There's that reference again to this brief period of intense persecution from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. So we were told just in the verses before this that he went to go persecute the woman, but we see here that she's given the wings of a great eagle. And so we see references like this throughout the Old Testament. God describes his deliverance of Israel from Egypt as swooping them up like with wings of an eagle. And then in Isaiah 40:31, those that trust, that wait in the Lord, they will mount up with eagle's wings. They will run and walk and not get weary and not grow faint. So familiar passages. But Exodus 23:20 as well as Colossians 3, first one talking about Old Testament Israel, and the second one talking about spiritual Israel, about us, that there is a place prepared for these where God was going to take care of them. So this is a language we've seen in several places throughout the Old Testament applied to God's people, just referencing delivering them, taking care of them, protecting them. But again, very figurative language. This was talking about actually bringing them out into the wilderness and then using the 10 plagues to deliver them from Egypt. All of those things is what was meant when these wings of a great eagle were used. All right, so that was the first one, but what we see here is the second effort. So if you go back through the Old Testament, you see where floods are used to represent invading armies coming in, and the idea is like they're busting out of their banks. Like you've got a river, it has some borders, right? It's not supposed to cross certain things, but then it overflows its banks and it starts flooding everything. And that's the idea of here is a nation, here's another nation, and one of them's coming up out of its banks. And it's coming in and it's taking over this other nation. And so it's used with that kind of figure and that kind of symbol. So Psalm 144:7 talks about enemies coming in like a flood. It's also used in Isaiah 8 about the king of Assyria, about Rezin coming into northern Israel and coming in a flood that way. But it's also applied in Jeremiah 46 as well as 47 to Egypt, if I recall. So this is something that is applied to multiple different nations. It's a general symbol to represent these kind of invading. So I think the idea would be is that we have some level of persecution that's brought in, and either that persecution spreads or intensifies. So whether you think of this as like Jewish persecution to the very early church and then spreading to where the Roman Empire is now trying to take over the church, or whether you think of it just happening on some kind of smaller level and then just spreading to more of the empire, either way the idea is the same. In both cases, the institution, the woman, is going to be taken care of. So how would the earth help? Well, Rome could not spend all of its resources going after Christianity. It had an empire to run after all. And so there would have been outside armies that would be coming in, causing problems for Rome. There would have been uprising and riots, and basically all of the politics and government that would go on day to day in a world empire, those things they would have to continue to use. So you would have, back to what Caleb said, you would have intervention, and I think we'll see later that it's God having a part in this. But what we're seeing right now is this coming out of the earth. So if you'll let me just kind of hang on to that as a question. We're going to come back to that because we're going to see a beast that arises out of the earth. And that gives us a clue as to what the earth represents at that point. So, and if you just can't handle it, just come talk to me and I'll tell you what it is before next time. All right. So, There is another way to think about this. This has been advocated by several people, that we know that the devil is the father of lies. So maybe what's coming out of his mouth is actually lies. It's propaganda. It's false doctrine. And so that makes sense. We have John 8:44 that is a good testimony to that. But the thing is well, then how does the world help? Well, maybe it helps by swallowing it, applying it, and then when they do, we can go, ooh, that's what happens when you listen to the devil. That's what happens when you listen to error. This is how your life gets wrecked and ruined. And so this stark contrast becomes a help. That's the idea that's often advocated with that. But it does feel like it may be a bit of a stretch. But I think for me, the tipping thing is there's the Old Testament references to these invading armies being referred to as a flood. So even though I have previously taught this, I lean towards the other one now, that it's the invading armies as opposed to the lies of the devil, even though there's support for that also. All right, any questions about this one? All right, so now that the woman is out of reach, carried off by wings of the eagle, he can't get to her directly. So then he sends the flood, but that flood is canceled out by the earth. So who does he target next? All right, so I know I gave this to you last time, but if the woman is the institution that represents the collection of God's people, then what is her children that we talked about? The individuals. So the institution will be protected, but the individuals will face death. They will face persecution. So that is something that they have to kind of brace themselves for and be ready for. So 12:17, and the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So you continue to see him. He has this plot. He has this scheme. It keeps getting foiled, where he's not able to take out and assassinate who he wants to. And so he kind of goes to the next level and tries to settle for that. And that keeps being taken away. And so in each time he is becoming angrier and angrier and pouring more of that contempt and that scorn and that rage on those that remain. So now, how about the application? How does this apply to us?
Well, it specifically notes that it's going to make war with the individuals who are following his commandments and stuff, right? So it's talking about, like, if you're doing what's right, you should be persecuted for it. Or maybe not should, but will. Like, it's a consequence.
Yep, very good. Other thoughts? Other comments?
I think it just adds weight to the kind of the way that we live our lives. Because if I think about language in Ephesians a lot too, about we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and all these like really intimidating imagery that says like this today matters. Like the things that I do today matters. The way that I live my life, because it's a part of such a bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And us, we are part of that bigger picture. We are soldiers on that battlefield. And I think that's the other lesson is dragon couldn't get to God, so he came to the child. He couldn't get to the child, so he came to the woman. Couldn't get to the woman, so he came to her offspring of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. They're gone. Who's here? Us. So he's going to come after us, and with this much rage and hatred, then as much as he can, then he's going to come after us. Now he may be limited so that he doesn't have the same access to us at first that he has to them, but as far as he can, he will come after us. So being prepared for that and realizing that these small things in life that we seem to kind of fret over and worry over and get taken in by, we should put them up against this bigger picture and realize how small they are. So going to Caleb's point, 2 Timothy 3:12, all who live godly in this present age will suffer persecution. That is a promise. That is a guarantee. Now the level of that persecution, that will vary from person to person and time to time. So, but that's something that we can count on. Matthew 5 in the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about blessed are those who suffer persecution when men revile you for my name's sake. And then he brings out the temptation. The temptation is we are God's light in a dark world, and that's what brings the heat. That's what brings the persecution. So what if we just cover the light up and don't be different? If we look like the world will stop persecuting us. So covering that lamp up, covering that light, that's the thing that Jesus warns us about. Don't put it under a basket. You put it up on the stand where it can light everything. You're the city set on the hill. So that's the temptation that we have to fight. And that's what the devil's trying to do just through bullying us, just through oppression and power and persecution. So we need to recognize that it's our turn to overcome just like it was theirs. And then I'll take you back to what I consider kind of the key verse or theme verse of the book. So chapter 12:11. How did they overcome? By the blood of the Lamb, they were forgiven. They're not standing on their own right. It's by Jesus' sacrifice. By the word of their testimony. So clinging to God's word that he delivered through those apostles and prophets. And then they did not love their lives to death. So being willing to go to the point of death, that is something that we have to prepare ourselves for. So I know that I've shared this with you several times, but because it's such an important passage, I want to just quickly review them again. I think the passages that are some of the most helpful ones for dealing with whether it's difficult temptations or difficult trials or difficult persecutions. Luke 14:25-35, have we counted the costs? Jesus talks about the man who goes to war, goes to build a tower, and he doesn't start by figuring out what it's going to cost him. And so then he gets into it and finds out, this is more than I'm willing to pay. This is more than I have. And so I quit halfway through. And so that becomes a mockery when people see that. So the key is to prepare yourself ahead of time. And very closely related to that, remember Ezra 7:10, as it's described here, that he prepared his heart to seek the law of God, and then to do it, and then to teach it to others. So the order is important, and the fact that he started by preparing his heart is important. And then as you go through 2 Chronicles, you'll find kings, some succeeded, some failed. And the reason that's brought out, among other reasons, is some prepared their heart to seek God, others did not. And when those who did seek God, they found mercy in very difficult situations in chapter 30:19 because they had sought God. And then in Romans 13:11-14, where Paul talks about the night is far spent, we need to put off the works of darkness. And then he goes on to verse 14, make no provision for the flesh to satisfy its lust. I think this is a critical passage to realize that the sins that we often fall into, the temptations we often fall into, the failure happens, if you think of it like a chess match, like 2, 3, 4, 5 moves before that. We put ourselves into situations where we are compromised, and it's almost impossible. Not impossible, but it becomes very difficult. We allow the devil to drive us into, a canyon where there's no way out. So step back, look at the bigger picture, see what's going on, and realize, again, you're on a battlefield with the ultimate enemy, and he's trying to destroy you, and he's pouring all of his wrath on you because you're what he's got left. That's the only objective he's got at this point, is to take out you and yours. So, and then lastly, Luke 16:8-12. Oftentimes, I know I've felt this, frustrated because I'm not able to do more significant, more valuable things, be a bigger help, do better things than kind of the small things that are given to me to work on. But Luke 16:8-12, Jesus, in the parable of the unjust steward, he says, whoever is faithful in little is faithful in much. And if you're not faithful in little, who's going to give you much? If we want to be able to do more for the Lord, we need to stop looking out in front of us like, I wish I could do what that person's doing. What's given to us? What are the things that are given to us? And maybe we think they're little, maybe they really are. But if that's what God's given for us to do, then we need to take care of that and trust him to give us much when the time is appropriate. So, are you taking advantage of the opportunities that are given to you? Don't despise them. Don't think of them as little. So, consistency. Are we saying one thing and doing something else? Do our actions actually match our words? And then, if we're not doing these things, then how are we going to overcome? We're not going to be able to when this level of persecution comes to us. So, if we want to overcome, we've got to make the same choices they made, prepare ourselves and prepare our children and those that are around us to be similarly prepared. All right, any other thoughts or applications? Caleb?
I was kind of thinking about Romans chapter 13 with that, kind of thinking of Ezekiel chapter 14 where it talks about if you have your idols and your desires still stored up in your heart, God's going to answer you according to the desires to keep them before you, and you should not expect his help.
Right.
And that he is faithful for all those who do truly call upon him.
Yeah, very good. Another good passage that we have to be diligent in minding our heart and making sure that we're cleaning out all the idols from there. Again, back to the parable of the sower as well. If we're the shallow ground or if we're the ground that's covered up with thistles and thorns and briars, then we need to till it up and get the ground deeper and get those earthly distractions out of there and get focused on God so that we can succeed and so we can overcome. Anything else? I mean, this is a sermon verse. We could camp out here. But, and I say that because I want you to. Once we leave this, I want you to keep chewing on this and thinking on this because this is a life-changing verse if you let it stay there and don't let, back to the parable of the sower, if you don't let the birds come and take it out of your heart. So, chew on it. All right, this takes us to chapter 13. All right, so now we have a transition, but it ties very closely. This is not a separate scene. This is what happens next. So Revelation 13, 1 to 10, we have this beast. What is the origin of the first beast?
Comes out of the sea.
All right, very good. He comes out of the sea. So how does this help us understand what he represents based off his origin?
It could be a conflict having to do with a nation or some sort of societal antagonist or something.
All right, so we know that it's in some way because the sea or the ocean represents society, nations, and politics. We know that it's in some way connected to that. So verse 1, then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. Notice the then, all right? We're just transitioning from one thing to what happens next. And I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. So I've shared these verses with you before when we looked at Daniel 7. So I'm not going to go over them again. Lots of passages that look at various aspects of the sea and the ocean to represent various aspects of government, politics, and nations. So the thing that I want you to think about, and I think the strongest connection we've got to any of the other Old Testament books happens in this chapter. So this should remind you a lot of Daniel 7 and the beast that we saw in Daniel 7. All right, so I want you to think about that as we continue through this. So, with that preface, tell me about this beast. What does he look like? What do we see here first?
It looks like a leopard, but his feet are like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion.
All right, so we have this beast that's made up of multiple different pieces and looks a lot like we're going to see in many ways, but different what we saw in chapter 7 of Daniel. So the beast has, again, 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns. On his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. So apparently this is his body because his feet are like the feet of a bear and his mouth is like the mouth of a lion. And notice here's one of the key things and the reason why we've been driving to this point. Where did he ultimately come from? Okay, he came out of the sea, but what made him what he is? It's the dragon. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. So this war that we're in, this thing that we're fighting, we see one thing, but behind it is the devil, and he is using it as his tool. All right, so now let's go back and compare it. Y'all seen this chart before. So going back to Daniel 2 as well as to Daniel 7, we made the case before that those two visions are basically taking the exact same picture and elaborating on it. So we've got the empires, these four world empires that we know from history are Babylon, Medo-Persian, then Greece, and then Rome. These correspond to the head of gold, the arms and chest of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and then the legs of iron with feet mixed with clay, being Rome. And so in Daniel, we see those four separate beasts, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then this dreadful beast, unlike anything else, that has iron teeth and 10 horns, and it's speaking great blasphemous words. So what do we see in Revelation 13? The same thing, but different. Just like Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are different, this is also different. We're not just copy-paste. This is a little bit different, and we're expected to handle the adaptation, to see some different points. So this is a single beast, but it has the same characteristics from each of the ones that have preceded it. So, what does that make you think? We're not seeing four individual things, but we're seeing a single composite thing that has attributes of all four of those. But if you think about it, we've actually already seen that point in Daniel 2. What is a head of gold by itself? It's not worth very much. Or arms of silver. Each of these sections make a man, make a whole. There is a single entity that is behind these, and it's represented as a man. So we have these four world empires, four separate sections, but in Daniel 2, it's a single body. Daniel 7 emphasizes that it's four separate things. But they are working together. They are being used together by a single source. And so we've already identified who that is. Where is the beast? Where did he get his power, his throne, his authority from? It's from the dragon. There's one entity behind all of these things that has one agenda that's driving all of this. And what is the tool that he's using from Daniel 2? He's using man. So there's two lessons there. One, we are being used. We are a tool, a pawn in his game. The governments are. The other lesson is what is the extent and what is the limit of this tool? In the end, it is just a man. So there's something that should help us to be more aware, but also provide us comfort all at the same time. So just like Daniel 2, all the elements are combined into this composite enemy. And I believe the idea that, like we've talked about before, is in two ways. First of all, each of these other nations were basically decapitated. Governments were taken out, but the bulk of the people stayed in place. So for your average person, the image may change on the money, and where the address they send it to may change, but not as much is going to be changing. The other thing is, and this is the key point in Revelation, spiritually, they are all the same. There is one entity working behind all of these. And from that perspective, they are one, because they are being driven by the same source. So, again, allusions to what's actually behind it. Now, one other thing I didn't highlight here, how did this beast look compared to the dragon? Same number of heads, same number of horns, different number of crowns. This empire looks an awful lot like the dragon. And I think that is also a lesson to us before. If we give ourselves over to the dragon, and if we take what he offers, then given enough time, we become little copies of him. We become just like him. So something else that should also help to warn and motivate us to be careful not to let him use us, because then we become pale imitations of him. All right, so there is a difference, though, in the crowns. Remember, these are diadems, not Stephanos. So these are not crowns of victory. These are crowns of authority. This is what a king wears. So the sea beast has 10, all right? So this would suggest to us, if 10 represents maximum human capacity, then he's exercising all the authority of man. All right? Now, the dragon, he has 7 diadems. He has all the authority that God has given to any entity. All right. So this one is limited by God giving him authority, and the other one is limited by what he's made out of. He's made out of people. So he can't have, and he does have rule over all of the people as well. So I think there may be a suggestion and an explanation for the difference in numbers, but otherwise they are very similar creatures in both of these. All right, any other questions or thoughts about the sea beast before we leave it? All right, I didn't state it clearly, but just for the record, so then what does the sea beast represent? Yes, he is Rome. He is the Roman Empire, and spiritually, he represents all of the world empires, and that they have the same motivation, the same power, but specifically it is Rome, and it is specifically Rome that is targeting the Lord's church at this time. So if you think about it, every world government has varying levels of enmity with God's people. But there's very few, I would say, if any, that are totally friendly to Christianity. And so this becomes the worst case scenario, if you will, the ultimate form, the ultimate enemy, where you have an empire that has given itself entirely over to the devil, to be used by him. But of course, that's not what they're thinking. They're doing what they want and not realizing that that's what happens. All right, so we have, just like in Daniel, we have these 4 different worlds, successive world empires. And this last one is, and it's spiritually a composition of all of them. And from a population standpoint, probably as well. All right, so compare the description and the activities of the horns in this chapter versus what we saw in Daniel 7. What do we learn about the horns? What are they doing? How are they described? All right, so they're both wicked, they're both blaspheming, they're both very arrogant, and we see that in both cases, exalting themselves against God. Anything else?
The fatal wound's kind of similar to the one horn growing up after the others were broken off.
There's similarity in the sense that you've got something that's singled out, and then you have something that's being kind of cleared out of the way, and then something taking its place. But there's differences there, right? So in one case, you have one horn displacing 3 others, and then in this one, we have one of the heads receiving a mortal wound. It also could be that it's not that the head almost dies. It could be that actually the head does die. But the entire beast is not destroyed by that. That it's able to keep going even though it does receive this dead head. And that it is killed. So there's a couple different ways I need to dig into that and see if it can be understood. But I saw one person who suggested that. So, all right. So the other thing I was looking for is in their blasphemy, not just blaspheming God, but again making war against the saints. So on his head, a blasphemous name. He was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority. Again, notice the idea of authority being granted to it. To continue for 42 months. So there's our same intense period of persecution time again. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So just like in Daniel 7, we've got a huge empire spanning many peoples, having authority over many different groups. Again, we have one of the horns at least being pompous and blasphemous, and it being associated with this. And we see it also, again, making war not only against God, but against his people. And he, again, being limited, not having free reign forever. He's limited to this period of 42 months or 3.5 years. So there's a lot that we see that's very similar to Daniel 7 that makes it very easy to tie and make us very confident in tying it to Daniel 7. But going back to Revelation 10, there's more things to be said. So what's new here that we haven't seen in in Daniel 7? What new things are revealed to us? All right. So we see one of the focuses of this is we have the sea beast bringing worship, but then where does he ultimately direct this worship? What is his motivation? He's directing it back to the dragon. All right. So his goal, his motivation is ultimately to bring about not just blaspheme against God, but ultimately bring people over into the devil's camp. So this is what Caleb mentioned a second ago. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshiped the dragon. All right, they didn't worship the beast. They worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb. All right, so there's another clue, Caleb, to separation between the earth versus those who are those who are written in the book of life of the Lamb. But I think we're going to see an even stronger clue for us here in just a minute. All right, so new things. So we realize now, again, we've taken a step back and we've been shown that there's a bigger picture. It's not just this beast, but there is the devil, the dragon behind this beast who is using it, who is giving his throne and great authority. And we do learn that in some way it was injured in some way. Something halted, something was stopped, and it was almost killed, but it was healed and able to continue. And then we also learn that those who are lost, not regenerate, they are amazed by this. This is the power. This is the thing that they see and they respond and they react to, and this is what they're following. So it is becoming their God, if you will, who is in turn directing all of this ultimately to the dragon itself. And so the world has become totally confident that nobody else is going to be able to challenge the beast whatsoever. So again, just to kind of collect what we've been saying, I think one of the big things that we learn from this that we didn't see in Daniel, or up to this point even in Revelation, is at the end of the day, we're ultimately in a war against the devil. And he is using these governments to persecute and to oppress. He's using all of these different things and other things we're going to learn about. But again, this is a lesson to us to wake up to how serious of a struggle, of a fight that we're actually in. Our enemy, our adversary, the devil, as Peter tells us, is going about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So Ephesians 6, we fight against principalities and powers in heavenly places. This is not an earthly struggle. So we do learn that this is going to appear to be stopped for a little while, and then it's going to resume. And again, the goal of this is ultimately to divert worship away from God. And this is an expression of his great wrath, but his objective is to produce unbelief, apostasy, to make people turn away from God. All right, anything else that pops out to you that we haven't seen before? All right. So, what instruction is provided in the patience and faith of the saints that is worthy of extra attention? All right, so why are we asking this question? So chapter 13, 8 to 10, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. Every time we see that, that means, hey, this is something that's hard to understand or that's hard to accept. So what is that? He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. So very quickly, what is it that he wants us to pay attention to? It's giving us a warning that whoever uses or responds to this persecution to conform in any kind of way, this is what they give is what they're going to get. What they're chasing is what's going to happen to them. What they've done to other people, that's going to happen to them. So if they're violent and if they use persecution, then that's what's going to be turned on them. This is something that we have to believe. This is what we believe. This is what our faith is, and so we trust in it. And this is what enables us to be patient, that someday this will be repaid. This will be made right. And so it helps us to trust and have faith. Ultimately, this provides us comfort that when we're taken care of, mistreated, eventually God's going to make that right. So think about the prayer in the parable of the unjust stewards and making sure that we're still being faithful when Jesus does come in judgment. And then it helps us to provide courage. We shouldn't fear what man will do to us. Think about Hebrews 13, 5-6. What shall we fear? What can man do to us? Has he not said that he will always be with us? A terrible paraphrase. But the promise that God will be always with us and that Jesus will be with us and that we don't have to fear what man is going to do to us. So we have that helps us to endure those things, that it will be made right eventually, even though right at this moment it may be very wrong. Thank you for your time and thank you for listening. And if you got any questions, I'd love to hear about them. And I hope to see you all Sunday morning. Thank you all.